So I think Jonathan Donner will be presenting his work now on platform upskilling in marketplaces. So go ahead, Jonathan.
Thanks, Jay. Let me see if I can share the screen here. It's the window I want to share, right? Hang on one second. Apologies, getting into present mode and share that. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Great. Thanks. I'm also going to try to keep the time here. Thanks, everybody. This has been just a super interesting few days, and I'm happy to be part of this last set of papers. This is work presented with my co-authors, Marissa Dean, Jessica Osborn, and Annabel Schiff. And we're all at Caribou Digital, which is it's a consultancy basically looking at building more inclusive digital economies in the global south. This work was funded with the support of the MasterCard Foundation and is animated by this question of what is platform-led upskilling. So the two things I'm going to do in this talk is set up what this concept is to begin with, and then pivot to what does it mean for ICTD. And there's actually an open ask at the end of this, which is I think it's an interesting and potentially important area of research for ICTD, but it's been under addressed to date. And let me see if I can get that thing to go. Thanks. So again, animating question is the size of the skills gap and employment challenge all around the global south is huge. In Africa, where Caribou Digital does a lot of its work, we see 15 or 20 million young people entering the African labor force each year, seeking better livelihoods in an increasingly digital world. Where do they get the skills they need? So skills acquisition is a broad question. I mean, training beyond the classroom is a multidisciplinary topic. It's got several connections to ICTD. They're in the paper, and I don't want to go into too many details here. But the first setup is that there are very few papers that are directly engaging with the idea of platforms being a source for training or skills acquisition. Some of the exceptions to that are the Cloud Learn project at Oxford, a paper by Raval and Paul in CSCW last year, and Shruti's paper from this conference just last session mentioned upscaling as well. So it's on the radar, but it hasn't been addressed sort of systematically. So the animating question is, what is platform-led upskilling? Our definition going in was we sort of defined it as the training that marketplace platforms provide to small-scale vendors and to self-employed workers, even outside the scope of a traditional employer-employee relationship. And we thought this was interesting to explore because it's good for the platforms. Essentially, they need to do it to train the people on the platforms to provide better services. It's potentially good for workers and producers who learn more skills, improve their craft, and sell more, improve their livelihoods. And it's potentially good for countries as a whole if a more skilled workforce is good for the development of a country. We think this is important because there are several marketplace platforms everywhere. Now, it's not limited to eBay and Amazon and Mercado Libre or whatever. It's all around the world. So Insight to Impact, which is another research consultancy, has identified over 350 active marketplace platforms in just 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa alone. These include marketplace platforms where you're selling goods, local services like domestic help or ride sharing, and global online work. And there's a lot of research on this already of things like mTurk and Upwork and others that are active just in Africa. And I just want to caveat what I'm going to say for the rest of the talk with this very important point, which is that upskilling and platform upskilling is really only one part of the phenomenon of platformatization of labor. And there's a rich literature which goes far beyond this in a much more critical way about what does this mean for power and livelihoods and inclusivity of digital economies, fair work, IT for change, Mary Gray and Suri's work on ghost work, Shruti again with the group, the work we just talked about. All of this is important to put this in context. Upskilling is just a part of the puzzle. So for this work, we used a case method project where we essentially started by talking to the platforms themselves. We did 15 primary in-depth interviews with the people at these various platforms who were responsible for the training. If they were a small firm, that means it was the CEO. If it was a startup, if it was a broad company like Uber or Flipkart, then it's a training division essentially. And we tried to mix African-specific platforms with other platforms elsewhere in the global South with some international players from the global North. Also, given the type of project we were doing and for MasterCard, for the foundation, we also documented what we were doing both along the way, and then afterwards we came back and had a separate approval process with some of the platform reps who agreed, separate from the main study, to be on camera and talk about their project. So in this case, I want to share just one 2-minute video from Jamia, which is a marketplace platform active in Africa, just because it does kind of sum up so many of the approaches they use. Hopefully my video will work here.
Previously, even at Jamia, we just thought it was that easy. List your products, start selling. But as a company, we are growing at a very fast rate. Like, I think we are one of the biggest companies growing in Kenya. So with the number of vendors that we are having, we are creating processes and systems, and these things need to be scalable. Like, we cannot hire a very big team just to deal with the vendors. So we're trying to make our vendors autonomous. So by doing these trainings, it makes that scalable. We actually forming what we call a knowledge center. So right now the knowledge center is just open to Jamia vendors, but in future we want to open it up for SMEs. And this is actually a very big thing. Like you can see, like we've just opened this new state-of-the-art training facility. Like there's a huge demand for training. So we have the various ways of training. So our biggest model, we cannot ignore that we are in Africa. So our biggest model is offline training. However much online training is scalable, but a lot of vendors are still interested with a personal touch. So in offline training, we have 2 forms of training. So we have the basic training, just to equip vendors on e-commerce and how to work with Jamia. And then we have refresher trainings to help them like grow and sell more, okay? And then we also have online training. So we have a website created for vendors where they can actually get everything that they need. So a vendor will just go and search, how do I grow my sales, and get everything.
I've had various trainings in Jamia actually. I've had both online trainings and offline trainings. The main content they created in the trainings was, one, to create content in my items, because for you to sell well, you must have good content in your items. The other one was creation of training on changing prices, because you have to have very competitive prices for you to sell well. You can't just have a stagnant prices. You have to have at times promotional prices, so you go down. There are times when you go up when the product is missing in the market. So the online training is mostly through the YouTube, 1. 2, we send clips in our website. You can download various clips. There are clips there. 3, we have clips online through Facebook. That is online. When you go to offline, we go for physical training in a hall, and we have vendors. We have very good trainers. In Jamia, we call Jamia University, just like any other university that you can have. So with Jamia University, you get to have good training, and you're given the content on all the knowledge that you require actually to create an item.
All right, thanks for that. So I'm going to touch on that video a couple times in the discussion. So the 2 parts that are left are I'm going to run through, I think, an inventory of what types of trainings are around, and then I'll go to implications. And it's the implications I really need your help with. So the main findings are what we tried to do through these interviews was we ended up with sort of a matrix. So we found that there were several approaches to training, some of which are mentioned in that video, and several content types. And when you put that together, you actually end up with a bunch of different sort of business cases and rationales for this. So interpersonal was mentioned in the Jamia video. This is Gokada, which is a motorcycle ride hailing in Nigeria. And they do a bunch of face-to-face training. They have drivers drive through cones for safety and all. And interpersonal, every single platform we talked to did at least some interpersonal. It's a big deal and probably a bigger cost than they want it to be because it doesn't scale very well. but they need to do it. Online help is maybe the thing you may be most familiar with. If you ever try to sell something on eBay or something, there's a ton of content about how to be a better eBay seller. And a lot of the platforms that we spoke to all around the world, even the ones in sub-Saharan Africa, were building their online help kind of library as well. Flipkart is very proud of the library that they have and the fact that it works in multiple languages. And I think the third type of content is the most interesting for kind of the broader theory questions, and that's this idea of training moments. And this is something where the participants may not even know they're acquiring skills while they're doing it. So Jamia, for example, has this thing called the content score, which is that little 65 up in the corner, and that score gets better as the information that the would-be seller is putting into the Jamia system gets better according to Jamia, and that's an artificial intelligence sort of nice UI or UX that's building this. This is expensive to do. Who knows whether it's working as well as it should, but I think it's really interesting that platforms, particularly the big ones, are able to make these sorts of investments in workflow that kind of nudges people towards better outcomes and better products and services. There's types of content. Look, there's a bunch, but vocation-specific skills like Fundi in South Africa, in Kenya, trains carpenters, and so there's a carpentry center they can go to learn in. Taobao, which is a giant e-commerce platform in China, trains its vendors on how to make better photos, which is kind of digital literacy. Uber invites its drivers to training on how to do better money management and savings and budgeting. And Gokada, that motorcycle hailing company, teaches soft skills, like just customer service and things. And again, these get mixed in different types of channels. So the business case for platform-led upskilling is that the platforms have to do it. And there's a lot of quotes about this in the paper. I won't read this one in the interest of time. But they do it because they have to, and if they don't, the services aren't good enough. The calibrating the right approaches is difficult, and it's an ongoing open question. And they do most of it themselves. I think they'd like to have more help and more third parties doing training for them, but they sort of have grown these capacities organically. So what does this mean for ICTD, and why am I raising it today? Well, what I'm not interested in is simple training that just teaches people how to use the platform, right? Platform proficiency, what we call that. What we're interested more as a sort of development question is to the extent to which some or all of these trainings result in potentially transferable or portable skills. And if there's enough of that happening, that becomes a source for training, which I think is interesting to us as researchers and as people who advise policymakers. But this development case for platform-led upskilling requires a lot more scrutiny than has been given to date. So there's probably no better community than ICTD to engage with these questions and ask things like this. How widespread is it? Our sample was just 15. We'd like to get a proper inventory of all the types of training that are around. Is there a really demonstrable impact on the individual workers, the gig workers in the small firms? How would you measure that with RCTs and things? And that's a big investment in training in research to do. Are the impacts actually portable, or do they end up locking people into being tied to that single platform? This question has not been asked in enough detail yet. And finally, and maybe most importantly for all of us, is how does this intersect with the kind of the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion that we know very well from our research? Things like gender, things like kind of rural versus urban, things like class, all are going to get mixed up with this idea of upskilling in a way which I think we could, as researchers, draw attention to. So I think one of the powerful ways to do that, this is one of my two last slides, is just by by action research, which is engaging alongside kind of practitioners, kind of doing while learning. And you could do that in a series of ways. You could frame upskilling as a development contribution, as some platforms have done. You could help platforms forge new upskilling partnerships with NGOs or folks who could reach out to specific underserved communities. You could nurture a broader community of practice so that the best intuitions about how to do training weren't locked inside those individual platforms. And you could build an ecosystem around training, which would include things like experts in training or portable credentials would go a long way towards making platform-led upskilling a thing. We're doing some of this in 2020 and 2021. We're going to get at the impact question by talking directly with workers, and we're going to do some action research. We'd love to talk more about that with you in the months ahead. So just as a conclusion, if you're interested in this, please do email us or get in touch to discuss projects or feedback or research questions or partnerships. We're really grateful for the conversations we're having already and look forward to more. Thanks to the MasterCard Foundation for supporting the project, to the participants and to the reviewers on this paper who made it a lot better and pushed it to be much more of an ICTD paper. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. It was a really nice talk and super interesting research with obviously lots of research opportunities. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks, Jonathan. That was a great topic. Great talk on an interesting topic. This reminds me of when you and I were both in India. There were these. I think sometimes they were called personality development, and it was meant to help the class of people who are going into jobs like, retail, cashiers and so on, where, generally the people who took these jobs had relatively low educations, but they were constantly interacting with well-educated middle-class people. And so they needed, training on how to, greet somebody when they come to the cash register, how to talk to them, how to ask questions, how to, do all of that. It seems like this is, in that vein, although not necessarily, not about the same kinds of context. What's your sense for, whether these are phenomena that emerge anytime there's like a, dramatically growing economy with new classes of labor?
That's a great question, and I think that some of these are evergreen, kind of perennial issues, right? And so I think one of the ways I'd answer this is that what you call this depends on where you approach it from, and this sort of relatively sanitized term for it is soft skills. It's customer service, and every platform will talk to you about, oh, we wish we could train soft skills. Look, and there's got to be a best practices on whether that's even possible to do or not, and then you can really begin to unpack that. I mean, I think Joyajit and Raval's paper from last year got into this kind of issue of what does professionalization look like, and what are the kind of the class markers and all that are really being kind of pushed or problematized through this type of training, and that's a broader question than we've been able to answer to date. But there's definitely something going on there where people are being brought into close proximity with a sort of set of customers, particularly where those platforms are serving first. They tend to be kind of upper income and urban consumers that puts a lot of stuff under the banner of soft skills, which is clearly broader than simply a customer service script.
Other questions? I have a question. So, I mean, it's probably obviously nuanced and different for different training, but do you have some sense of, or have you thought about how well aligned these companies are with sort of our mission of development-related education?
Yeah, that's a great question and needs to be restated all the time. Because as I mentioned early in the talk, this is only one part of a bigger puzzle with platformatization of labor and supply chains and value creation. And there's Diode Research Network that Richard Heeks helped convene, has a ton of great papers on this. And it's not clear that all the news is good. And a lot of the early scholarship suggests that a lot of the news is bad and really challenging about what it means to have a gig job and an unstable job and a job governed by an algorithm and all that. But not all the news is bad either. And I don't want to kind of I don't want to kind of say that we're on one side and the other side. We want to kind of examine this, kind of critically and carefully. But this is just one part of the puzzle. I would say that it is one of the parts of the kind of the ways in which platforms can interact with the broader society and kind of be a better citizen in this domain than they are perhaps in other parts of their organization. And I think it really depends on sector, depends on the platform itself. Things like the Fair Work Foundation is doing a lot to kind of rate the performance of platforms and how well worker experiences are on these given platforms. And I think that, for example, you could put you could introduce an additional lens of how much training occurs and how successful is that training into those kinds of questions and evaluations.
Great, thank you.